Welcome everybody to our latest live stream tonight, and we're absolutely delighted that we've got the very wonderful Lesley Riddoch with us tonight. I don't know if she needs much introduction, but obviously she's a long-time journalist and author and fan of all things Nordic and cycling and all sorts of campaigns, and huts. We might get onto huts later on. So we will be talking politics tonight, just as a warning, and we will be talking about independence because that's part of the stuff we're going to discuss this evening. So anyway, let's start with the first sort of thoughts. Thinking about kind of where we are at the moment in the UK in general and Scotland in particular, it seems that we're kind of heading for what I'm kind of thinking of a perfect storm, because we've got COVID going on and getting worse and more restrictions coming in. We've got the end of furlough coming up. We've got the internal markets bill, which I think we should have a few words about. And obviously we have the awful Brexit that we are facing as well. So there's all sorts of, not necessarily competing, and some of them will go alongside each other, but all sorts of issues. So how do you feel about where we are, and is there any optimism? Will we get through this storm? Is this storm coming, and will we get through it?
Well, kind of obviously, countries do get through things, and we have got through things in the past. But I mean, all superlatives just become redundant so quickly at the moment, because you think you've got to, the mother and father of a situation, and then yet another little, or huge burden is kind of added on top. The question, I suppose, would be whether people just begin to kind of pull their horns in and start to feel that they're so inundated with challenge and threat and uncertainty, that they really don't want to get round to anything more substantial in terms of, changing the constitution of Britain and becoming independent. And that's the one that's kind of a bit of an imponderable, because so much of that really lies in the hands of Nicola Sturgeon, to be blunt. And she does, there's a lot of mixed messages really coming from the top of the SNP about pretty much everything to do with that. So I think we're all stuck a little bit, if we were in the middle of a campaign at the moment, or at least if there was some sort of strategy, or at least if we felt that once we got closer to the May elections, something that would kick in that resembled a kind of campaign that people felt they could get involved in, it would give you somewhere to put your mental and emotional energies. But at the moment, it just feels like we could, just like COVID, we could be going on like this for a very long time, never quite sure when we're getting anywhere close to a chance to sort of air all of this stuff instead of just sitting biding our time. So yeah, I think this is a massively frustrating time.
So do you think if COVID hadn't happened, that we would be in a better position to be looking towards May and looking towards sort of change then?
It's kind of a difficult one to say. I've got to say, I don't think so. I mean, at the moment, this may sound like a kind of big SNP bash here, but you're asking these questions. I mean, the SNP is the only major political party in Britain that has not yet scheduled a conference. I mean, a virtual conference. That everybody else is having one, and it's all scheduled, done and dusted. So it just seems like you don't get a feeling that the SNP is kind of driving anything particularly at the moment, from the leadership point of view. So I would have thought actually COVID has given a little bit of cover to what is otherwise a bit of an instinct to avoid being pinned down or to have open debates. It hasn't actually even been a debate about independence at the SNP conference for, I don't know when it was, when there was last a debate. So I don't think everything is very good in that respect.
Okay, I mean, I can't really comment on that because I'm not a member of the SNP and I don't really know any of the politicians. I'm not involved, but I just look at her on the on the platform every day talking about the COVID thing, and also people across the world are seeing her. I mean, I listened to Lee Child and Val McDermid having a chat last night on Bloody Scotland, and he's living in the wilds of Wyoming, and he was saying that he sees her, he sees her in the wilds of Wyoming, and he thinks she's doing a great job because the persona that she puts across, or it is of concern and competence and cracking on with the day job, and obviously for people who want independence, that's probably is quite frustrating, because she and the thing with the BBC and not wanting to show the debates as well, that's all put, she has to kind of in those things concentrate on the COVID thing.
Yes, and I mean, I wrote a column in the Scotsman today saying exactly that.
Oh, did you? All right, I haven't read it, but
it's okay. No, it's a free world, I mean,
yeah.
and I've written it several times, and I'm actually speechless with admiration for Nicola Sturgeon's communication abilities. I've rarely seen anybody better ever, full stop. That's one of her many hats. But you were asking at the beginning about independence, and it's unquestionably the case that not banging the drum very obviously, and doing essentially show not tell, showing that governance can be different in Scotland and better and more trusting and more all of those things. That showing is unquestionably, compared to what's been going on south of the border, has unquestionably moved people over who were kind of hovering. So that's absolutely true. All I'm saying in response to what you're asking about where we might have been without COVID, or where we're going, is that I don't think, and I'm not seeing and I'm not hearing, that there's any great strategy beyond this to try to sort of try to turn that sort of support for Nicola personally in her role as First Minister with the COVID hat on, what a horrible hat that is, to something that is then, it's that moment where you have to sort of shift feet, almost shift your weight from one foot to the other. That's kind of a tricky one. And, we could end up with a tremendously popular First Minister, a tremendously popular SNP, people that have even shifted across towards supporting independence with no strategy for getting independence whatsoever. I mean, all those things are quite possible to be happening all at once. So anything I'm saying about, the lack of strategy doesn't mean that Nicola isn't a fantastic communicator.
Okay, well, maybe we should get her on and talk to her sometime. That would be good. I believe we have a question, Paul, from the floor. If you'd like to ask
There's
it.
people out there. Hello, people,
there are people out there.
We can't see.
There are people out there.
It's quite good, because usually we don't get questions this early in the chat.
Oh,
so
right, okay. Well, maybe you don't get people who are quite that provocative then.
But yeah. So a question from Roberta Gilmore, which is just kind of voicing the same frustration, really. How many mandates do we need? What's your view on the mandate for another referendum?
Well, I mean, in a way, it's probably a bit like, in fact, there's so many parallels between this and the way that COVID press conferences are held. When anyone is asking about some particular aspect of lockdown COVID policy, the point is very regularly made that it's it's almost like a complex, like a matrix of things, where you think if we do that, then that might cause that, and that might be worse for the children, and that might be worse in the long term for everyone. So we better not do that and try this. And actually, some of this thing about mandates are the same, because we could have, of course, there's a mandate to have pushed for a Section 30 order from 2015, pretty much. Where we are now, though, is the sort of importance of having crossed that 50% mark on opinion polls can't be underestimated. Because that's some of the reason. It's the two things together. It's Nicola, putting a much better face on governance than almost anybody, actually, but certainly, the most sympathetic face in Britain. It's that combined with the fact that the cause that she stands for is just quietly also crossed this magical 50% mark. So, getting to the stage where you're talking about a mandate now, of course, there was always a mandate. But it was a mandate to move forward when the polls were still sitting slightly the wrong way around. A mandate now is kind of quite a different thing. And I think that's where people are beginning to feel kind of worried and impatient, because it feels like it could just be the same answer as before. We just got to wait. We can't force Boris Johnson's hand, blah, blah, blah. And yet the situation is different, because we have managed to get across the 50% mark. And I suspect much higher than that, when people are actually given an active choice and have to think through stuff that many people just don't want to have to be forced to think about. So yeah, I think that's what the mandate question is. You can have an academic question about mandates till the cows come home, but really it's been super turbocharged by that shift.
Okay. Obviously, one of the big problems is that you know, Johnson and Keir Starmer have both been on attempts at you know, to kind of rally the troops and raise the Union flag in Scotland. You know, whether they're doing it successfully or not, I don't know. But that makes it difficult. What am I trying to say? I don't know what I'm trying to say. You know, because they're trying to, you know, that Boris is saying, "Oh no, we'll never give you another shot at it." I mean, is there a route? Can you see a route if they keep putting their foot down, and saying, "No, we're not going to let you have another one"? Is there another route, or how can we turn that?
Well, I mean, the first thing is, if you look at what they're up to their necks in at the moment, who knows what their actual strategy is regarding Brexit? I mean, who knows if they ever really meant to get a deal, or if they're just the crappiest negotiators in the entire history of the universe. You know, it's hard to tell, actually. Let's just assume that they're just not very good, that they did actually have some half idea they were going to try and have some sort of deal, and we're just postponing, because it's just kind of what they do. When things get difficult, they'll just agree something, kick it down the line, and then think, oh, we can probably unpick it later. I would imagine that the way that they've dealt with what seems more important to them, which is Brexit, will probably be a template for how things work for everything really in the future. So it won't be very simple at all, this. But you will get to a stage. I mean, even look at the outcry there's been over the prospect of them breaking international law.
Mm-hmm.
They are now backtracking as quickly as their little feet will go, although it does still look that even with the amendment that's proposed, they will actually still be breaking international law. So they haven't exactly resiled from that. But I think that they get to a stage where they're in a negotiating situation at the moment. They all are. You know, they're going to have to go through an election in which the only reason anybody would vote for the Scottish Conservatives is that they are ferocious unionists. So, you know, you can't kind of basically hobble your troops before you've even started by conceding that the same party at Westminster level would pay the blindest bit of attention to this. They've decided they're going for hardball. The Scottish Tories are kind of like the hardest balls of the lot when it comes to all of this. You know, they just limp, you know, they'll just fall in exactly with Boris policy. So they're going for a very, very hard approach. But I mean, all the evidence is there. Then, you know, when that fails, and if there is some concerted strategy to insist, like joint manifestos, you know, between the SNP, the Greens, and perhaps the other parties on the list, I don't know. But, you know, you could start to do stuff that began to make clear that there was something different happening this time. And I think it would be very difficult, albeit, you know, by that stage, Britain could well be like a sort of rogue state, you know, sitting on World Trade Organization rules, sort of beyond the pale by, you know, in the eyes of the rest of the European Union. And it could be difficult to kind of leverage action, because they might not be part of any larger group of people who are basically civilized. So that could be difficult. So route B, Martin Keatings is taking a case through court at the moment, crowdfunded court case, to try to prove that the devolution settlement is kind of blurry when it comes to who has the ability to hold referendums. And his contention is that Holyrood already has the power to have, without a Section 30 order, to have an official referendum. Once again, it's kind of ironic that the the money that they've spent on crowdfunding so far, I understand, has mostly been spent on defending themselves against the Scottish government rather than the British government, who they've really essentially taken the case against. So at the moment, it's like the Scottish government don't really want anybody else on the scene. However, pardon me, that could come up with, that could just come up. I mean, it's not very likely, but it's possible that it could come up with the news that you don't really need to get the permission of Westminster. And, there would have to be some other thoughts behind that as to kind of how perhaps it might be. Some people would like the SNP to stand on a platform of not taking their seats if this continues and they aren't, we aren't given a second referendum, essentially an abstentionist position. Some people suggest that the SNP should do that already, but I know that certain of them who feel quite strongly about this point out that Sinn Féin, for example, make it very clear before they're elected that they will not take their seats. So if you know what you're voting for when you go for that, whereas the SNP have never before they stood said they would not take their seats. So that's all. There's all there. If you meant to do something, there's ways of kind of upping the ante, especially as you said, since Nicola Sturgeon has got slightly the eyes of the world upon her sometimes. But none of that seems to be being, there doesn't seem to be these kind of plans coming together, albeit in the middle of, COVID racking back up again. I think a lot of people would cut, the First Minister some slack on this. The only trouble is, and I hate being sort of, bringer of bad news or whatever, and I'm not a member of the SNP. I just listen to a lot of people who are. They've had ample time to get a lot more done than they've got done before all of the lockdown happened.
So with the internal markets bill, do you buy the argument that it's a power grab, or the Tories' argument there's a power surge for Scotland and for Wales and Northern Ireland?
It's unquestionably a power grab, but it's a sort of sneaky one in that. I mean, in many ways, the thing that's sneaky about it is essentially it's dragging a Trojan horse into Holyrood, and from that horse later things spring. So it's not so much necessarily that you can sit and list the various rule powers that are being removed right now. It's the requirement to have mutual recognition of standards. I mean, that sounds really comfy, mutual. What's wrong with that? But that basically means as soon as the Westminster Parliament is forced to have a race to the bottom to try to get some kind of trade deal, whenever that happens, we have to accept their standards. I mean, essentially, the lowest standards will be the ones that prevail, and that's not even card carrying kind of cynics and independentistas. That's people like the National Farmers Union for Scotland, who are really worried about this. There are other aspects to it. Some of the stuff that they came away with, that there needed to be, a sort of single system so that doctors would be able to work across the border. This is extraordinary because doctors are already regulated by Westminster across the whole of Britain. So what is that? There's no need for that. In other things, they talked about plumbers being able to work across the border. Most plumbers that have got any kind of qualifications have got City and Guild qualifications, which once again are regulated from London. So, and we've actually managed in a devolved setting for so many years crossing a border whilst having mutual recognition of our different certification systems. So why it's suddenly become so difficult now, it simply is an attempt to get complete control so that you can basically shut down all arguments and deliver the deals without any irritating little, but what about us kind of, sounds coming from Scotland. And Les Huckfield, who is a former Labour trade minister, was on a podcast I do every week with me talking about this and saying that basically from here on in, what Boris needs is money for the red wall seats in the north of England. And that's also why this mechanism is being put in place in the Trojan horse that is the Internal Markets Bill, that any ideas that the Scottish Parliament comes up with have to be put before a panel of theirs to determine whether or not it kind of fits in with their subsidy systems and so on. Well, you can bet your bottom dollar that anything that looks like it competes with shipyards, car manufacturing, any kind of industry in the northeast of England will somehow just not manage to get through, because that's where all the money has to go. So there's any number of things about it that are cute. I can't quite remember all of them off my head here, but that, in addition with the other bill that's going through, the agricultural bill that's going through in tandem, lets you kind of see really where we're going with this. So it's a clever thing in that it's not an assault walking through the front door with a Exocet and everybody goes, right, they're after us. It's this housing of a tedious, boring sounding piece of legislation with confusing kind of googlies thrown in, like mutual recognition. And it takes quite a bit of translation to say to people, hey guys, this is really serious.
So, I mean, with regard to the standards thing and that kind of stuff, if we want our pathway to be out of the UK but into the EU in some way, isn't it the case that the further our standards kind of go away from the EU standards, the harder it would be for Scotland to kind of argue to get a place back in?
Yes, I mean, in a word, I mean, yes. I mean, at the moment, there isn't a problem because we don't diverge.
We're aligned, yeah.
And of course, when this gets raised, the Tories will say, but I mean, we have imported all of these regulations into British law. Well, yeah, but you can see how quickly these guys can change something. I mean, that which they did with the withdrawal bill is the lie to everything. Something
absolutely.
that was absolutely, they won an election on it. They managed to, do you remember those scenes of triumph when Boris didn't die in a ditch and instead got this incredible deal at the last minute? I mean, all sorts of things flowed from that lie, which has now just been completely, unveiled. So really, that's kind of what you can expect from here on in.
So why do you think that people aren't awake to this? Are they just, they're just so cowed by the situation we're in at the moment that they're just not aware of all this? I mean people across the whole of the UK, not necessarily just in Scotland.
Well, I mean, without being unfair to folk from south of the border, I wouldn't imagine they give a toss. And fair enough. I mean, you're allowed. As far as people are concerned here, it still feels a little bit like I still think there's a problem about inertia from the Scottish government, because if what would you do if you really felt that your parliament was basically was under attack? The very essence of it was under attack. Would you do something?
I would have thought so.
Because if you don't, I mean, I organised a protest on the 31st, which some of you might remember.
I know. I listened to your podcast about that. We were actually there. Some of us were actually there. We'd been in Edinburgh that day, and we went down with the other people that we were with. Morag, I think Morag and Neve. Do you know them?
Yeah.
And people like that. And we had our own protest in Glasgow that night as well. And but we weren't doing ours till 10. So we had some time. So we went down to Holyrood. And I actually met Val McDermid that night. She was just standing next to me. So that was quite interesting. But no, it was a great night. No, it was really fun because when I started listening to your podcast, that was the first one that came up when you started talking about how you were organising this thing. And I was thinking, yeah, I was there too.
Right, okay. Why was I organising that?
Well, I don't know. Why were you organising that? Presumably somebody asked you to.
Why?
Well, because nobody else
just
did
think about quite, and who
but,
might
I mean, we did our thing in
No,
Glasgow.
I'm not getting at you. I'm getting back to the question you've asked, which is, why do you think people are not sort of alert and kind of getting going? And I humbly suggest if anyone really thought, if the members of the Scottish Parliament and the leadership of the Scottish government thought that the whole institution of devolution was under attack, you might expect something of a sense of urgency and some action. And when we actually came to the very night that, Scotland was being dragged out of the EU against its will, neither the government nor the party nor the MSPs had organised diddly squat. So I'm sorry, I think it is very, very poor. And personally speaking, as a complete unpaid volunteer in this, I get sort of, I don't mind doing stuff, but I do wonder why it takes somebody who doesn't even live in blinking Edinburgh to do things which this government and Parliament is paid to do. I mean, they're paid in essence to try to make politics zing and relevant and kind of mobilize people. But it's left, the business of doing anything that attracts publicity is basically left to everybody else. And I think that's when people don't entirely think then that it's all that serious, because you don't see something that's kind of led from the Parliament's point of view. And I can see some of that, I can see that it can look more powerful if the people are sort of so aghast that somebody's going to put their dirty footprints all over the Parliament, that we spontaneously, rise up and protect it. But it would not be nice sometimes to have even a conversation.
Yeah, I guess so. And I'm thinking as well of all the marches that we went on in London, all the pro-EU ones, and it was all grassroots groups that just sort of, well, no, it wasn't all, because there were some, well, we won't go into the history of all of that, but there were some other people involved. But basically, it was a kind of people's thing of coming together on the streets. And
yes, but that didn't have the benefit of being held in a country whose parliament is run by a party that also believes in what you believe in. You are there protesting to stay in the EU with a Brexit supporting government in England. Right? Why is it that people are having to organize stuff in their own spare time to try to make a protest about the position of Holyrood in a country which wants to remain in the EU and didn't think it was worth organizing anything for 31st of January? That's all I'm saying.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you're certainly making me think about things in a different way, for sure. So thank you for that. How much time? Oh, we're nearly getting towards out of time. I don't think I'm going to ask all the questions I was going to ask. So should we talk about huts?
Sure, but I mean, it's hard to know who else is there actually, because it's it's only that I'm only seeing the 5 of us. But I mean, if people want to ask other things, just let them fire. Is there no other questions?
Have we had any more questions? Oh,
not yet.
No, not yet.
Well, there's a lot of people agreeing with what you're saying.
Right, okay.
There's a lot of kind of voicing of similar frustrations.
Well, just let me say that, I mean, in the spirit that kind of, we seem to be in, it occurs to me that we need to do this again. I mean, we've got a date coming up to October the 15th, when we at that point may well be effectively out without a deal. And what are we going to do about it? Are we just going to sit there and look at each other? Are we going to wait expectantly for the SNP to organise something to demonstrate how pissed off people are? Or are we going to do something? So I can tell you, we are going to do something. So there are plans afoot to have another thing for October the 16th. However, obviously
we're under restrictions, aren't we? Or we're likely to be.
But to the limits of what we're able to do with restrictions, we'll try to do something. Because the point about that event on the 31st was, as somebody who spent 25 years in the BBC, it's not hard to see that there are events and times and a shifting perspective by the media on this, and they basically just there's times when they need a backdrop to tell a story. And that day it was obvious that all the Scottish correspondents would be the presenters would come over and say, but in Scotland it's a very different story. And every single network would be standing there saying, yes, actually here in Scotland, people are really hacked off and voted Remain. What's behind them? You know, that's all we supplied on the 31st of January. And that's why we timed it as we did it, 6 o'clock till 7:30 to cover every network bulletin. And so we were on every network bulletin because we didn't organize something to suit ourselves. We organized it to suit what we knew would happen, you know, what their bulletins would want, and quite a lot of international coverage. And those international people are still in touch with the Edinburgh Yes Hub, wondering when something else is going to happen. So, you know, watch this space because we are trying to piece something together.
Okay, well, that's useful to know, and obviously, if we can get across, we will, because you know, we're keen to do anything to support what's
well,
going
it might have to be something clever. You know, it might have to be, if we are completely locked down, we might have to think of how to do something in some online way to show that, to mark this day and to register. It might be one of those Twitter, I don't think of the right word, but Twitter storms, you know, when everybody does something at the same time. But anyway, we'll let you know for sure.
Yeah, do please. Well, we will talk about huts in a minute, just because we haven't really talked about much of the Nordic stuff, and obviously if we're looking towards independence as a route to a different relationship with the EU, for some of us ideally that's full EU membership, but could you just briefly go through the differences between EU, EFTA, EEA, Schengen, you know, Euro, all of these different things? I did a little dot diagram of, I know you've got one in the book as well, of which countries are in which, and they're all not in the Euro apart from Finland. But
yeah, it's easier to go back to the beginning, really, to the 60s, because everybody thinks there was only ever one European trade body, kid on the block, but actually there were two, and really EFTA sort of pretty much predated what became the EU. And Britain was a founder member of EFTA. So EFTA wasn't really aiming to have a single currency. It doesn't now, and didn't want or aim to have institutions. It was really just wanting to do trade, you know, just literally what it says on the tin. So as the EU began to become more ambitious in its outlook, actually people just peeled off and really went and joined the EU, including Britain, ironically enough, 1973. So EFTA became a smaller and smaller club, which currently now only has Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, you know, tiny little countries in it. Norway and Iceland are there because they don't want to be bound by the common fisheries policy. A lot of people, if you've seen the Norway film, particularly that I did about that, one of the experts in that, Øyvind Brattberg, says that really the Norwegians had just come out of an experience of being run by the Danes and the Swedes for, you know, 300, 400 years. So they just weren't at a stage where they were going to hand sovereignty over to anyone else. So the EEA kind of lets them have this halfway house where they're not governed by the institutions of the EU, but they have access to the market. And crucially, perhaps for Scotland, in terms of a messy border that we might now have, they're not in the customs union. So there's advantages there. Obviously, the disadvantages, I mean, apparently in Norway, the EEA, which is, well, EFTA is a trade body. It almost gets like a free pass to go into the neighboring club, you know, on a special occasions and kind of Halloween and stuff like that. So it's like they're getting a free pass in, and the construct that lets that happen is the EEA agreement. And the EEA is the 4 members of EFTA, with one taken off because Switzerland unaccountably decided it wanted its own bilateral agreements and didn't want to join the other 3. So it's the 3 from EFTA, the 27, as it now is, I think, from the EU, and together they are the EEA.
Yeah. So
I hope that's sort of clear. Yeah. But the difficulty for Norway is that, you know, basically they don't make any of the regulations they observe. It's often said that Norway observes more EU regulations than Sweden, which is a full EU member. And the EEA is referred to in Norway as the Nike agreement, as in just do it. because they have no ability to argue or
No.
discuss what is being imposed on them. But I mean, a poll about sort of 8 years ago in Norway found that only 18% of Norwegians wanted to resolve that by becoming full EU members. So they are still massively against EU membership, but equally the idea of pulling out completely and not having a kind of deal to access the EU markets is equally unpopular.
Okay, that's kind of said something about that. So that will lead us into huts, because we can talk about the huts in Norway, because Norway has this, and actually Sweden. I've got an uncle in Sweden, and they have a summer place, and it's just a very simple one. And even my sister, who lives in Greece, she has a little tiny cottage in the top of the mountains, because it gets very hot where she is in the city. So other countries do have this kind of culture of having somewhere you can escape to, somewhere in the countryside, and it's the relationship with nature that's really important as well, isn't it?
It is, but it's kind of like, what are we for? You know, I think that people are asking this increasingly because of the COVID lockdown. The kind of almost frenzied materialism and consumerism that was our norm has been somewhat kicked into touch, and of course that's pretty grim because it means lots of lost jobs. But we have been kind of really kind of lathered up in all this kind of stuff. That's what we do in our spare time. You know, a day in a shopping mall, a trip around the shops, a night in the pub, a weekend in the pub. I know that's not everybody's experience, but the idea that you might just have a little home, which in fact for most of the Nordics, and Norway is the one I know best, is the permanent home. You know, you'll change your home many times in a lifetime to cope with changing. You know, if you need more bedrooms for bairns, if your workplace changes, you move, but you never move your hut. So that's what everybody else is getting out of having one. And at a wooded latitude, which is where we sit, we're the only country that doesn't really have them at all. And before anybody starts going, but I saw one around the corner yesterday, there are 500 in Scotland, there are 500,000 in Norway, and we have the same population. But they also have more boats, more caravans, more special DNT huts, which are the mountain huts, mountain bothies essentially. So if anybody's kind of thinking, oh, well, that's, maybe the caravan is the Scottish hut, they've got more of everything. And actually, that's normal. That's more normal than we are. We have nothing.
And that's partly to do with land, isn't it?
That's very much to do with land.
Yeah.
And yet, all the different facets of it, because it's also to do with forestry. All these huts in other countries are in woodlands and forests, generally speaking. And our forests are cellulose factories. Even the Forestry Commission has until recently just been an institution that basically locks forests at night. So the idea of kind of people in forests is like mind-blowingly dangerous and weird. Whereas in countries where tens of thousands of people own forests, it's not a biggie. So really, this is an attempt to shine a light, particularly for urban Scots, and say, this is what you're missing. Everybody else has managed to get this little bolt hole that manages to keep city life sane, because you've got a physical way of taking yourself out of it for short periods into nature. And I wonder how many of our social problems, and I would also suggest the sort of general lack of confidence that comes from not being able to touch, own, and physically shape things together, that has an impact on our confidence.
And kids love it too. My little 11-year-old I look after came back last week saying, I don't think we're going to get our week away, our activity week next year. They've already told us that. It's like, that's something that they really look forward to in primary 7.
But see, that this is what I mean, because I know, I'm sorry to hear that. But what everybody else is doing is not looking forward till next year. They're looking forward to next weekend. I mean, everybody else's ideas of leisure are getting away from judgment, booking, expense, pressure, other people's ideas of what you ought to be doing every weekend. And we store it up for 2 blessed weeks of stress, you know.
Especially this year, anybody who's been away.
Every year, actually, you know. So really, this is just to sort of say, what are we doing with ourselves? Because if you can't get things like this right, you know, here's all the things that we've inherited as a feudal society, the last feudal society in Europe. And if nobody's really that interested in trying to correct things so that our well-being and our outlook and our happiness and these sorts of things matter, then honestly, who are we kidding about independence? You know, it's not going to be, and with one bound they were free. Yes, we're going to have to work our way through all the crap. And you might as well just start now with things that make you happy. How's that for a really mind-blowing idea?
That's fantastic. But before we go, we got one more question from Paul. I hope it's a good one, Paul, because that was a great ending at that point.
Yeah. So just a question from Jenny. It was a general question about just engagement, political engagement, but also engagement in the sort of things that you've just talked about. How do we get people motivated and excited to actually try to affect change like that? Do you think that us in Scotland and the UK generally are just less engaged than other European countries? And if we are, what could we do about it?
Well, it's hard to kind of a quick answer to this, but I mean, basically, one point is that the deadening effect of all, so many really, really stacked systems in Britain stops you before you've started. I mean, you try once, you try twice, you just don't try again. So, you know, you're sitting in Britain and England with an electoral system that means you might well be in one of the 10% of seats that haven't changed hands since Queen Victoria. Are you going to vote? Probably not. Will you be called apathetic? Yes, you will. Are you? No. If you're looking at questions like this about land ownership, does anybody look like they give a toss about land ownership? No, they don't. The SNP's pushed the pork around the table a little bit, but looks terrified of actually doing anything big. And that just feeds a subliminal nervousness that actually we're not able to run a country without landed gentry. That having 32 dukes in Britain, all of whom own land in Scotland, is probably a better way to do it. So this is why I get angry with politicians, because their silence is complicity in many instances, because people assume that if something was deeply wrong and you saw a solution to it, you would kind of voice it. So I think, you know, the answer is we just need to set up hutting communities and make them work. And I'm happy that since I've started pushing this around a bit, there's basically, I've had all sorts of communications from people everywhere trying to think and sometimes offer little bits of land. But if they do that, they will be inundated with people wanting, because the demand for this sort of thing is stratospheric, you know. So yeah, I think at some point when we finally get to a stage where we've got independence, or even we've had to stand it down for a certain amount of time, it will give the opportunity for different parties to form that have different priorities to try to push some of these things along.
So are you still thinking of setting up a party yourself?
Honestly, I could think of nothing I would hate more apart from sort of being imprisoned, because it is, to me, that would be like being imprisoned. I'm really not a person that does structures very well. I have no personal ambition whatsoever, which you can tell because I'm sitting here shooting myself in both feet as far as any kind of influence would be concerned with the SNP. But I can't see a way to affect politics in Scotland without eventually doing something in the electoral arena. So, you know, I would force myself to do it if it felt that the time was right. But I think a lot of people, whilst we're still in the run up to what keeps feeling like being Indie Ref 2 round the corner, no one would thank you for that.
Yeah. Okay, well, that was brilliant. I'm sure I hope everybody watching feels kind of like, I don't know, inspired and just kind of like, I don't
Well,
know.
just
I can't
a bit
think of a good word.
energized. That's all
Energized,
I
yeah,
ever hope
that's
for.
a really good word. And just wish we didn't have this blooming COVID and all the restrictions and all the rest of it, because we've been frustrated not being able to organize anything, not being able to sort of do much, get together. We did one little chicken thing in Buchanan Street a couple of weeks ago, which was quite fun.
No, nice one. I mean, I've noticed that.
Did you see that?
So, but it's good to do that, because
we were all there.
well, but there will come a time when we haven't got COVID restrictions and we're able to do something, and all the little practices that everybody's been doing will be quite important when it comes to the kind of direct action that might have to happen before Brexit. And I mean that before December 31st. Before
December, good. Right, an energizing autumn and winter, folks.
Yeah, somehow.
Thank you so much, Lesley. It's been absolutely brilliant talking to you, and please keep in touch about the 15th as well, because we'd like to know what's happening.
Right, you are. I'll do that.
Thank you.
Okay then.
Thanks.
Bye everyone.